What's happening? What's happening? And as you all know, I love to say what's happening. Welcome to another episode, if you will, of the African American Folklorist of the Month. And for the month of May, we are honored to recognize Dr. Bill H. Turner as our African American Folklorist of the Month. Dr. Turner is a distinguished sociologist, author, cultural historian, and one of the most significant voices helping us better understand Black life in the Appalachia, especially in the coal towns of Eastern Kentucky and the wider Mountain South. Born in Lynch, Kentucky, in Harlan County, Dr. Turner comes from a people whose lives were shaped by coal, kinship, migration, labor, church, family, and community memory. He is the fifth of 10 children born into a family deeply connected to the mines. His grandfathers, father, uncles, and older brother were all coal miners. But through his work, Dr. Turner has shown us that Black life in the Appalachia is not just a footnote to labor history. It is a full cultural world. It is a breathing world. It is one marked by dignity, struggle, intelligence, humor, discipline, beauty, migration, survival, and deep-rooted traditions. His work helps correct one of the oldest myths in history of the Americas, the false idea that Appalachia is and always has been only white. Through the book, The Harlan Renaissance, Stories of Black Life in Appalachian Coal Towns, and his foundational contributions to Blacks in Appalachia, Dr. Turner has helped put Black Appalachian people back into the story where they always belong. I am honored is an understatement right now to be able to speak to this gentleman. Good sir, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you, Lamont, Jack Purley, for having me on your show.
Thank you for the work that you do. And, I haven't had the opportunity to fully read the book. I went through it briefly, and what I saw so far, I think I'm going to put it on my book list for my dissertation and quals exams. And I think I want to start there before we get to your story. The idea of conducting or creating such an ethnographic work that can be considered sociology, folklore, all of the ologists, if you will. First question, what was the void that you felt needed? And then we can go into how you decided to go about filling that void.
First, I'd like to mention that this book that is titled The Harlan Renaissance was preceded 40 years ago or more, 1985, in fact. I helped to co-author a book called Blacks in Appalachia. It was published in 1985 by the University Press of Kentucky. At the time that it was published in 1985, I was the Dean of Arts and Sciences at that time at Kentucky State University, an HBCU in my home state. So if your question is, I understand it, and you might want to restate it in case I missed it. You asked what inspired me to do this present work. Is that what you asked?
Yes, the work in general from 85 to now. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, like a lot of people, I shouldn't say that. In my own process of maturing, when I was in my 20s, let's say, and while does not matter. I'm a lot older than 20, as you may know. I'm 80 this year.
God bless.
Yeah. But having grown up where I did in Harlan County, Kentucky, we were enveloped by the highest mountain range in the state of Kentucky. It was called Black Mountain. I saw it every morning when I came out of the door on all four sides. So for me, and because of the way the coal mining industry was structured, I almost always knew at the instructions of my father, I don't want to ever see you do this kind of work. You have to grow up and get out of here. I don't want to see you be a coal miner. So I was continuously looking over the mountain, as it were. Where's the promised land? What am I going to do? And of course, my father, although he only had 6 formal years of schooling, my father was a well-read person. Jet Magazine, Ebony Magazine, Negro World, the Louisville Defender, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier. And of course, we were tied to the rest of the world by WLAC radio out of Nashville, Tennessee. You might remember at that time in the 40s and the 50s, WLAC was one of the few 50,000 watt channel radio stations. And so that tied us to the rest of the South in particular. And so I always thought that the essence of Black life and culture and the people that I read about in these magazines that laid around in our home and in the barbershop, that the epicenters of Black life and culture was far away from my home. I thought that it was in those places where many of our people were moving to. They were moving out when I was 10 years old, 1956, the coal mines were becoming highly mechanized, so that the Black men who had been drawn there in the early 1900s to serve as coal miners, within 50 years, roughly 2 generations, by 1950, the out-migration was porous. I mean, people were leaving constantly. They went to Chicago. They went to Cincinnati. They went to Dayton. They went to Cleveland. They went to Chicago. They went to Milwaukee. They went to New York City. They went to Atlanta. They went to Chattanooga. They went to those places where lots of Black people out of the South who left in that second Great Migration. That's where they went. So that's where I thought that all of the happenings were. So that when I began to look around about what am I going to study when I was in graduate school, for example, in the mid 1960s, I went to the University of Kentucky. And after that, I went to graduate school in 1968. I went to Notre Dame. And when I got to graduate school, scratching my head as I am now, you had to come up with a focus of what are you going to study. You just can't say you're going to study sociology or anthropology. So I really thought that, I'm going to look at some aspect of this great civil rights movement. So I wrote my master's thesis looking at a contrast between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and their perspectives on civil rights. That seemed so exciting. But I kept in the back of my mind that, wow, everything I'm reading about the civil rights movement, oppression, worker issues, health care, power struggles, race relations, well, somehow it all crystallized in my mind. Well, gee, I don't have to look at Chicago, Miami, or New York, or Philadelphia, or Baltimore, or Los Angeles, or Denver, or these places. I can just look back at home because we were a minuscule example of those same forces, where our people had moved to what I would call the North Central manufacturing states. People went to work in steel mills in Gary. People went to work in car factories in Detroit. Well, it occurred to me that the very primary resource for all that manufacturing was coal coal drove the Industrial Revolution. And there was my grandfathers and my father and my uncles, and they had all been working in coal mines since the Civil War. My father's father, was born in the 1890s. 1893 he was born. So he worked in the coal mines of Virginia, 20 miles from where I was born. So all of that just kind of condensed in my head when I got together with Ed Cabell, God rest his soul, and we wrote this book. We co-authored this book. We found articles about Appalachia. And of course, one of the first great light bulbs over my head was, well, wow, the very person who is called the father of Black history was a man named Dr. Carter Goodwin Woodson, Carter G. Woodson, who had been born in Southwest Virginia, and his family moved. In fact, he was a coal miner when he was 13, Carter G. Woodson was. And then he went into Huntington, West Virginia, on the Ohio River, the Kanawha River. And so that was Carter G. Woodson, who in 1898, around the time my own grandfather was a child, Carter G. Woodson left Huntington and went to study at Berea College in Kentucky, which, as you know, Berea had started before the Civil War as a biracial institution, the only institution in the South that the first institution in the South that admitted Blacks and whites after the Civil War. Berea College was a majority Black college when it was founded. So that was Carter G. Woodson coming out of Berea College in 1904, right? Yep. And so the foundation was already there. It's just that nobody had told me much about Carter G. Woodson. And then there was another well-known African-American who had also come out of that same coal field in West Virginia, and his name was Booker Telefario Washington. Booker T. Washington, Malden, West Virginia, right outside of Charleston. So there were two of the most preeminent African-Americans at the end of Reconstruction who were doing all these things, but nobody thought about them as, quote, Appalachians, because everybody just assumed Appalachia was Daisy Duke and the Beverly Hillbillies. Right. Few people knew about the legend of John Henry and these Black workers who literally built the railroad networks throughout the mountains of the South to move this coal to its endpoints for the Industrial Revolution of America. So I had to learn on my own almost, because there were very few things written, or at least very few things that were popular about the Black experience in the mountains of the American South. Even though one of the first articles that Carter G. Woodson wrote in 1916 in the Journal of Negro History that he founded, one of his first articles was called Freedom and Slavery in Appalachia. Mm-hmm. And he wrote about that 100 years ago in 1916. What's that, 120 years ago, I guess? Yeah,
just about, yes.
Yeah. And so I was looking everywhere except in my own backyard for the kinds of information that after that period became the wheelhouse of my work, my comfort zone, my focus of interest, at least for the last 50 years, has been on Blacks in Appalachia. And even though 15 years ago I moved out of Kentucky, at the time I was a professor at Berea College, and my wife and I decided we wanted to live near our grandchildren because we both had grown up across the street from our grandparents.
Wow.
But our grandchildren were in Houston, Texas, where I'm sitting right now. So we moved here to be near our children. And thankfully, I've been able to continue my work in the mountains because I'm back and forth in West Virginia, in Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Almost every month, I get back that way in continuation of my work. It keeps me alive.
Sir, I have to. If I were in a hat, I would have to tilt it to you. Okay. You know, because it's necessary. And besides it being necessary, you've carved the space for so many of us to follow behind you and do our version of the great works that you laid down. Now, with that being said, there's so much that I took from what you just said, as well as from this particular book. I think the idea of, so you give a backstory, essentially a history of the space, and it seems that it is extremely important for you to put in context this historic narrative that situates you and your people there, but also, as you mentioned, multiple a good amount of Black folk. What makes, and I know you pretty much said it, but I want to ask you specifically, why was it so important for you to make clear and establish the Black roots of this area?
Okay. Well, it may have been just a matter of the course of my relationships with people when I went to college. My first 2 years of college, I went to a community college 5 miles from my home in Harlan County. I went to a branch of the University of Kentucky. It was a 2-year college that still exists. It started in 1963. I went there in 1964. But in 1966, I left my home. I was 20 years old. It was 60 years ago. I left home and I enrolled at what they call the flagship university in Kentucky, which is the University of Kentucky in Lexington. And of course, when I went there, not only was I like the proverbial fly in the buttermilk, because there were very few Black students at the University of Kentucky, or most universities in the South, when I was 20 years old. And one of the first things that would be a response to people, when you're 20 and you're new to a place, you're in a dormitory with 400. There were 3 Black people in the dorm I lived in, or 300 people lived in that building.
Wow.
And when you would introduce yourself, of course, the first thing they would say is, Lamont, where you from, man? And so when they would say, Bill, where you from? I would say, I'm from Harlan County. You see, in Kentucky, you've lived in Bowling Green, I understand.
I have, yes.
When you're in Kentucky, unless you're in Louisville or Lexington, and maybe Covington, but in most places, people will tell you the county they are from, as opposed to the town, because more likely you've never heard of the town. So they would say it like, I'm from wherever Paducah is. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but Paducah's a bigger city. You could say that. But in my instance, I would always say, I'm from Harlan County. Well, the first response from the people I had met from Louisville and other places, they would say, there are no Black people in Harlan County, are there? That'd be the first thing they would say.
Wow.
You mean to tell me you're from that place? And, I would say, not only am I from that place, my mother was born in that place in 1924. My father was born in that place in 1917. My grandmother was born in that place in 1896. My other grandmother was born in that place in 1876. So what are you talking about? There are no Black people there. Well, the fact of the matter, in my hometown, I could say without fear of contradiction that I never knew there was so many white people in the world until I went to college.
Wow.
Because where I grew up, the percentage of Black people was about 27% of 12,000 people in that little coal town I lived in. Now, if you went to my hometown today, 60 years after I left it, you will find no more than 200 Black people in our hometown. There are more people on my street than in my hometown now, because the massive out-migration.
Right.
I've told people time and time again that, for example, the entire state of West Virginia is part of the Appalachian region. The rest of the 14 states that are considered Appalachia, the rest of those 14 states, only part of the state is in the Appalachian region. Okay, half of Kentucky, the eastern half of Kentucky, where Interstate 75 cuts Kentucky north and south. It goes down the middle of the state. So to the east is Appalachia, but to the west is Louisville and Lexington and Richmond and Paducah and on out that way. So if you go to West Virginia, for example, that had the highest percentage of Black coal miners as the state of West Virginia. Well, if the out-migration of whites in West Virginia had been equivalent or proportionate to the percentage of Blacks who left West Virginia, there wouldn't be anybody in West Virginia.
Wow.
There would be no people there because 95% of the Black people have left that state in my lifetime, in the last 75 years. So the inspiration was to say, wow, I constantly hear people say, I didn't know that. Well, they didn't know that there was a lot of things I didn't know. Mm-hmm. So I had to do a lot of primary research. And you can never depend on the United States Census for accurate counts of Black people in rural areas because they would not go up in these hollers and count them. So I made it my business for about 30 years, really. I would go to Jenkins. I would go to Hazard. I would go to Bluefield. I would go to Beckley. I would go to Keystone. I would go to Big Stone Gap and Pennington Gap and these obscure little places that nobody knows about at Harvard University, even though one of the most prominent Black scholars, William Skip Gates, is from Piedmont, West Virginia. Gates grew up in West Virginia, went to Princeton when he was in high school. And as you know, you can't turn on the television much about Black people unless you hear about Skip Gates. But I'm serious, you know. Dr.
You're right.
You know, he did a book called Colored People, which was won him a lot of awards. But even in his work, W.E. Du Bois did a lot of writing about Appalachia, which few people didn't know. Few people didn't know, for example, that the Niagara movement, which started in New York, ended up having most of its meetings in a place called Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, which is where the Civil War started with John Brown and that arsenal that he overtook up in West Virginia. So that I began to say, wow, if you really studied it, people like Martin Delany came out of West Virginia. He's from Charlestown, West Virginia. Booker T. Washington. If you fast forward real quick, you say, wow, I even see a man named Bill Withers coming out of a place called Slab Fork, West Virginia. I'm working on a project with some people right now who are fast to restore the home in which one of the most prominent Black musicians grew up in Western North Carolina, and that is a woman named Nina Simone. Nina Simone was a mountain girl who grew up about 25 miles from Asheville, North Carolina. Roberta Flack grew up in Black Mountain, North Carolina. We could go on and on with a kind of checklist of, I bet you didn't know that my man Steve Harvey grew up in Beckley, in Welch, West Virginia, and graduated high school in West Virginia, and then moved to Cleveland. You know, so there's a who's who of African American people of note. Who's Tony Brown? You remember the journalist Tony Brown's journalist?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Tony was from Charleston, West Virginia. He's in his late 90s now, but he's always lived in New York City and Detroit as an adult. But Tony is very proud of his roots in West Virginia. The first Black president of Fisk University grew up in Johnson City, Tennessee. His grandson, Jeb Johnson, was the head of the Homeland Security Agency under Obama. So I relish when people say, I didn't know that, you know. And so when I was out there sometimes quite all along driving up and down the mountains with Ed Cabell in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, it's only been recently that we have seen almost a proliferation, if you will, of people's interest in Appalachia. For example, I'm sure you're familiar with the a Kentuckian named Frank X. Walker, who in the 1990s created a word called Appalachia.
Yes.
You know, and so there's a body of literature that has come out of this group in terms of the Appalachian poets, one of whom is Nikki Finney, a Pulitzer Prize winning author. Another Nikki Giovanni, toward the end of her life, began to celebrate her African-American roots in Appalachia. She used to spend her summers in Knoxville, Tennessee, where her grandparents lived. Nikki actually grew up in Cincinnati. So we've seen the growth like so much kudzu in the mountains of the South. This kudzu grows this time of year. It covers everything. So when I first started down this road, the fields were barren, and we began to find a lot of things. Then other people began to join us, and I'm so happy. Just about only 2 or 3 weeks ago, I addressed the 49th annual meeting of the Appalachian Studies Association, which was held at Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. 800 people showed up for that 49th annual conference, and there were dozens of sessions focused on Black women in Appalachia, Black farmers, storytellers. I'm sure you're familiar with the National Association of Black Storytellers.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Just last year, they honored me with their Zora Neale Hurston Award. So there are so many people, so many things going on right now. And I must hasten to mention that recently the Appalachian Journal published an issue that focused on a hip hop album that my son helped to. He was the executive producer, and we called it as a subtitle, Hip Hop at the Mountaintops. So we have a CD out with a couple dozen Black artists who do hip hop from West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, East Tennessee. The album is called No Choice. And we have a young man on there who's the lead of all of that, named Eric Mastalung Jordan. And his father, Mr. Jordan, the elder Jordan, who's passed away, Eric's father, Norman, was a contemporary with Amamu Baraka and Haki Matabuti and people in the Black arts movement of the 60s. So Ed Cabell out of West Virginia was also part of the Black arts movement with Baraka and those folk like Sonia Sanchez back in the 60s and the 70s. So like I started off pointing out about the pioneering work of Carter G. Woodson. And I might mention that anybody traveling up and down Interstate 75 should always stop at Berea College in Kentucky. It is ground zero for studies about Appalachia. I'm currently affiliated with Berea College still. I've been in and around Berea for the last 45 years. And so they have an Appalachian Center there, a Center for Appalachian Studies. And they have a marvelous, beautiful center named the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education in honor of Carter G. Woodson. Benjamin Hooks, who used to be the head of the NAACP. You remember Ben Hooks. His grandmama went to Berea College. Julian Bond, the former Georgia congressperson, his grandfather graduated from Berea College too. Kentucky State University grew out of Berea College. Berea College put up money in 1904 to establish something in Shelbyville, Kentucky, called the Lincoln Institute, named for Abraham Lincoln, because they would not educate Blacks in the public schools of Louisville. So Berea College has been the tip of the spear in terms of prodding the American South to live up to its commitments to equality and democracy. Berea is the most diverse population of students in the state of Kentucky and probably in all of the South, because at least 45% of the students at Berea are either African American or Latinos. And the Latino group there has just come there in the last 10 years. But yeah, that history at Berea is something else that people would say, I didn't know that.
Right. I mean, even with the Honorable Bell Hooks, which was a colleague of yours.
I'm so glad you mentioned Bell. Yeah, I have a picture on my wall just opposite me because Bell and I shared an office in Berea for 10 years.
Wow.
You know, and I was in touch with Bell to the very day that she passed on. Yeah, and you know, Bell had published 39 books by the time she passed on, and she was the darling of feminists. And there's a center at Berea right now called the Bell Hooks Institute, where her work continues there. And as you know, Bell was very metropolitan. Bell was Bell studied at Stanford, and Bell taught at Princeton and several other places. But she moved back home in 2008 because she wanted to spend the rest of her life in Kentucky, but not in Hopkinsville, where she was born. Instead, she moved into Berea, and that's where she staked her flag, as it were, for the last dozen years that she lived so gloriously.
You know, I think, and there's so many things that are amazing, but the one thread I would like to focus on, particularly because what I received from skimming through the book was your desire to put the story in the proper context. And it did amaze me. I don't know if you saw my face. You rattled off almost 50 names of people that most of us did not know they were from the Appalachia. We just figured they were either from Mississippi, Louisiana, Memphis, or Detroit, or Philadelphia, one of the major hubs for Black folk, right? Mm-hmm. But essentially, they're all from the space. I guess I don't guess. The question is it? Was it the writers? Was it the academy? Why? And this is not to take away from white folk, but the reality is, why were white educators, researchers, and writers only focused on non-Black Appalachian residents? Would you happen to know that? Did you find that out?
Why weren't they focused on it? Well, one way to look at it is that, you know, the Appalachian region itself has always been part of what was called the other America. You know, our white brothers and sisters, the Daniel Boones, if you will, those white pioneers who came into the Alleghenies, you know, into the coal mining area of even far western Allegheny area, Pennsylvania, which included Pittsburgh, you know, because the federal government considers Pittsburgh in Appalachia. The federal government, called the Appalachian Regional Commission, started in 1964. It also mentions at the other end of that mountain chain, and that mountain chain includes the Alleghenies, the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Poconos, the Smokies, all of that region. They also consider at the bottom end of that, the largest city in the southern portion of Appalachia is Birmingham. So if you go from Birmingham to Pittsburgh in a diagonal like that, you cross this mountain chain, and Birmingham at the bottom, so to speak, of that chain, and Pittsburgh at the top. Well, if you include that as the government does, you say, wow, Pittsburgh? Well, that means the man who helped us learn something about a lot of things is named August Wilson. August Wilson grew up in Pittsburgh.
Wow.
Billy Eckstine, the singer, grew up in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has a long list of very prominent people. Then if you go to Birmingham, well, gee, you would find that, oh, that's interesting. Angela Davis grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. So did Condoleezza Rice, grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. The whole civil rights movement, the 16th Street Baptist Church got blown up. That was in Birmingham, Alabama. So I would argue, and I have a manuscript to this effect, that the very origins of the civil rights movement were in Appalachia. Wow. In a little place called the Highlander Center, which is located in Newmarket, Tennessee, 40 miles east of Knoxville. But it used to be in Monteagle, Tennessee, down near Chattanooga. Now, when you put all of that together, you have to remember, because scholars in the 1900s, they looked at white people in the mountains of the South as another America that they really didn't understand, because they had depicted these Southern whites as being isolated. They were primitive. They spoke a different language. You saw a movie, I'm sure, called Deliverance.
Yes.
We all saw the Beverly Hillbillies.
Yes.
Right? We all saw the stereotypes of white Southerners in a TV show called Justified.
Yes.
We constantly saw references to the Dukes of Hazzard.
Yes.
We always saw Ellie Mae and Granny and Papa, and we always saw the Hatfields and McCoys,
yes,
and these violent people in the mountains of the South. But we never saw any black people in that mixture, although black people were constantly in it. So that even when they came up with the legislation for something called the War on Poverty, when John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and President Johnson, LBJ, they went to West Virginia, they came to Kentucky, they stood on the porches of these despised, oppressed people, but they never let you know there were any black people in the mix of all of that. So it almost seems, as you have pointed out so many times in your work, with blues, and when if you get over into the edge of bluegrass music, that's when they don't show Delfort Bailey, right? They don't show the people who taught the Carter family how to sing. You know, they don't cover. In fact, in recent years, when Beyonce, who's from Houston, Texas, did her cowgirl thing, they all act like that was so inauthentic. She's not country. You know, I love the story that Charlie Pride told once when he said when he appeared on the stage at the Grand Ole Opry for the first time, and everybody just went wild. When he walked off stage, a man said to him, "You know something, Charlie? You look like them, buddy, but you sound like us."
Wow.
You know, because Charlie Pride had that twang like my father, like
right.
my grandfather. People used to say, "Man, if I didn't see your daddy personally, I would think he was a white man because daddy talked just like that right there." He'd say, "Buddy, look at here. Here's what you got to do. We got to do this, Billy. We got to do that." And because he was a country boy. My father did not grow up in any city. So
right.
that the dialect of many rural black people in the mountains of the South, it is very difficult sometimes to separate it from. You have a woman on your website named Emily Hudson.
Yes, sir.
Out of Hazard. You ever listen to Emily talk?
Yes, sir.
Or Emily's about as country as she can be. I saw her a couple weeks ago. I've known her 50 years at least. Wow. You know, so the inspiration for me at one time, I was walking on the grounds of the Museum of Appalachia, which is outside of Knoxville, and I was with Alex Haley.
Wow.
Haley had moved into East Tennessee on a farm next to the Museum of Appalachia with his friend John Rice Irvin, and I had begun to help work with Alex as one of his research assistants in 1979.
Wow.
All right. And Alex took me over there to this farm, and it's a recreation of farm life in the mountains. And I said to Alex, "There's nothing about black people in this place. It's a 200-acre farm with recreations of barns and homes and pens for cattle. I mean, it's just a beautiful sight." And when I said, "This is just like everywhere else, so no black representation here," and Alex said, it's your job to do that. Then why don't you do it? If you don't write something that your mama can read, because that stuff you've been writing is for those scholars in some college. You need to write something your mama will look at. And
Wow.
that's when I started on the Harlan Renaissance. It took me 20 years to write that book because I had to go and talk to people. It was not things that were in libraries. So it was Alex Haley, God rest his soul, who really encouraged me to get started properly, to put the stories down. And even right now, I'm working with a friend of yours. I think you know a man named Dub Carnett.
I know Mr. Dub.
Well, shortly after the book Harlem Renaissance was published, I get this phone call from this country talking guy, and it was Dub. And Dub grew up in Appalachia, Virginia.
Mm.
My father grew up 10 miles from Appalachia, Virginia. I grew up 10 miles from Appalachia. Dub hung out with black people most of his life over there in Southwest Virginia. Yeah, Dub would tell anybody that. And Dub hung out at some of the joints I was scared to go into. Yeah, man. And Dub was right there with them, you know. And as you know, he has become a major music producer in Nashville where he lives. And he also has another home in Santa Monica where his studio, OSO, the Bear. So,
Yes,
so Dub and I are working as we speak on a documentary on Black women from Harlan County, Kentucky. And one of the central people we're looking at is a woman named Martha Redbone.
Mm.
You got to check out Martha Redbone. Martha is from Harlan County, but she lives in Brooklyn right now, and she's a major musical entity, musician. She and her husband have a group. So even as we speak, we're working on another documentary, Dub and I, that looks at the contributions of Blacks to country music, to Appalachian music, along with an ethnomusicologist in East Tennessee State University, a fellow named Dr. Ted Olson. And Olson is a premier student and teacher. One of his students is named Amethyst Kaya. And Amethyst is a well-known musician.
Yes.
Another person, Dom Fleming, who used to be with the Carolina Chocolate Drops. We just interviewed him a couple of weeks ago when he was in Asheville, North Carolina. So yeah, I hope it shows in my face that one of the things that still keeps me alive, besides my family, is my commitment, my blessing to still be able to get on an airplane and fly to Tri-City Airport in Bristol, Tennessee, and jump in a car, and in 2 hours I could be in the dark woods of McDowell County, West Virginia, which is the poorest county in the Appalachian region, is McDowell County. And so I still have a way to be involved with those. And going back to your original question along this theme, is that it was Alex Haley who pushed me over the cliff. And as soon as we got through talking about these things, I resigned from a post I was holding as an administrator at a college, because Alex said you can't do your work as long as you're tied down at some college. You got to get out. You got to get out there where the people are. And fortunately, I have been married for 58 years to a woman who at the time was a top executive at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco in North Carolina, in Winston-Salem. So, you know, our livelihood, our ability to educate our children was not dependent upon my income as a college professor.
Right.
So I was freed up, if you will, to do the work that I love, because it's only been recently that foundations have shown interest in Black Appalachia, you know, and so even now I'm part of a group called the Appalachian Black Community Developers, and it's a network of 10 or 12 Black nonprofit organizations in Eastern Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, Southern West Virginia, and East Tennessee, and we're picking up other organizations in North Alabama, Yeah, because as I said earlier, you probably know of a woman named Marie Cochran, who does her work out of North Georgia, because 80 miles north of Atlanta, you're in the middle of Appalachia,
Right.
the Appalachian portion of Georgia, where Ed Cabell died in Rome, Georgia. That's in the area where Margaret Taylor Greene is from. So that's an Appalachian part of Georgia.
Wow.
The Appalachian part of South Carolina is rich in Black history. Spartanburg, Greenville, South Carolina, what they call the upstate of South Carolina. Of course, Western Maryland, Frostburg, 5 or 6 counties in Western Maryland. Few people would know, for example, that one of the most prominent colleges in America is in the Appalachian region, and it's called Cornell University in New York State, upstate New York. My sister-in-law, I tease her all the time about having gone to college, an elite college in New York. She went to Vassar, and Vassar is in the Appalachian region, according to the Appalachian Regional Commission. Which sometimes some of the, just like much of Africa, the continent itself got carved up like a cow, by different countries. Well, Appalachia got carved up by the federal government. So that many parts of Appalachia, those people want to have no part of being Appalachian identified. For example, Roanoke, Virginia refuses to say, we don't want to be called that because there's a stigma.
Right.
To it. Roanoke. Chattanooga is in the Appalachian region, but Chattanooga does not lay claim to that as an identity because still Appalachia carries a major stigma of being poor white trash.
Right. So
not my words; those are my quoting words of how America looked at that part of the country.
Right. Absolutely. That has been a trope since the way blues documentation has been. I think it's equivalent to the Appalachia, which leads to a question I wanted to ask you. Because your work reminds me of Clyde Wood's blues epistemology, right?
Right.
Could you talk to us about a pattern or relationship or connection between the plantations of the South and the coal mining camps of the Appalachia? Is there a relation? Is there?
Okay. Well, to the extent that at the end of slavery in the 1860s, and the next 20 years between 1865 and 1895, for example, that was called the Reconstruction era. And as you know, the South might have lost the Civil War, but they did not lose the Reconstruction, because it was reconstructed under Plessy versus Ferguson, which essentially said what? Black people have no rights, which white folks have to acknowledge. And so they set us up as second-class citizens. And as Malcolm X taught us, a second-class citizen is nothing but a slave. It's the same thing. So when we think about the connection, of course, not only is there historical connections, because particularly in terms of the migration that pulled African Americans out of what we call the Cotton Belt, the Black Belt South, Birmingham. Birmingham is the Black Belt South. In fact, Birmingham, as you know, was next to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is still the home office of United States Steel. At one time in the early 1900s, 1915 in particular, the wealthiest men in America owned coal mines. That's where they made their money. One of them was named Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie Hall, New York City. Andrew Carnegie. The people who founded United States Steel, because steel became the very element for the construction of railroads and bridges and refrigerators and cars and trucks and bridges and highways, all of these steel rods that you have to have. Well, who was going to do that work? Where did they go to find a labor force? They went to places where there used to be plantations outside of Birmingham. They went to Jasper, Alabama. They went to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. They went to Talladega, Alabama. And my distant cousins on that side of our family who had come out of Georgia and Birmingham, well, there are thousands of them, as you know, who went up the East Coast primarily, if you follow what is now Interstate 95 from Boston to Miami. Well, that trail didn't start with Interstate 95. It started at the end of the Civil War when these plantation workers went to work in the factories of the North. They went north up that same route. And what did they do? They stopped in Charleston, South Carolina. They stopped in Wilmington, North Carolina. They stopped in Richmond, Virginia. They stopped in Washington, D.C. They stopped at the 30th Street Station in Philadelphia. They stopped at Grand Central Station in New York City, where Harlem grew up. And then they went on up to Boston. Well, the reason I called mine the Harlan Renaissance is that another group of Black people who didn't go to those big cities, they went over into the mountains chasing those jobs that were available in those holes called coal mines. And in the instance of my own family, my father was born in the region. So my great-grandparents were born in the mountains of Appalachia. They didn't have to move there. They were already, our family's been there 245 years. You know, going back to the fact that when you look at anybody named Washington in the United States, including Denzel, they came off a plantation owned by the first president of the United States named George Washington. Those same Washingtons. There's a whole bunch of Washingtons down in Southwest Virginia where our family came from, and they all ended up, many of them ended up in a place called Farmville, Virginia. If you study that historical spot, because that's where my grandmother's mother came out of, my great-grandmother, twice removed, ended up in Southwest Virginia off of some property owned by George Washington up around what they called, I almost called it Monticello, but Monticello was that other president, wasn't it?
Right, yes.
Same guys, man. Same guys. Yeah. George Washington was once asked about, how can you be the president and have 400 slaves? And he said, well, I would free them, but it would be a mighty economic loss on my part. So he never freed his slaves. And of course, we know what Thomas Jefferson did with his.
Right.
One of them named Sally Henning. We know that story. So there's a deep tie with the plantations and the burgeoning economic and industrial development that came up in these rural areas where coal mining was the primary. So we went from king cotton to king coal. That's all we did. And for 125 years after slavery, these people worked in these coal mines, and then they found ways with the surplus money that came from coal mining, since they didn't pay people a heck of a lot of money. What did they do? They did research and development so that they developed machines to do the work that the people used to do. And so when my father's generation was replaced by machines, my father's generation, my father didn't have to do it, thank God, but many men in his generation, they moved, they followed the trail to Detroit and to Akron and to Youngstown and to Cleveland to work in what? The car industry, the steel industry, in what we call the Rust Belt states. Because as you know, how did they get that name Rust Belt? Well, even in the burgeoning place called Detroit, there was a big old city when I was a kid. Well, now, you know, Detroit is about a fourth of the size it was 60 years ago, because they came up with new ways to make cars without using all these people. And then all these cars started coming from a place called Suzuki and from Germany and from Italy, you know, in the yards out here in my neighborhood in Houston, man, if you see an American car, it's like, oh, wow, somebody's driving a Ford. Well, and it's usually an F-150, you know.
Yeah, tell me about it.
yeah, many suburban families, though, have foreign cars. And so now we're seeing a whole new generation of Black workers, what we might call auto workers, which were very good jobs, by the way, because when people left our hometown out of the coal mine when I was a boy in the 60s, man, they said, hey, man, Mr. Pearly got a job in Detroit. And then Mr. Pearly would come back home in a Cadillac about a year later, man. Because, they sold him that Cadillac at a discount, and he came back to show everybody what he had.
Right.
And so now you go to Detroit, and that's why it became such a shadow of itself. And Detroit is trying to rebuild itself in a new economy based on healthcare and financial markets.
Wow.
So it just continues to evolve. It continues to evolve. And what I find most helpful in terms of students of history is you have to look at how did we get to where we are now, where were we before? So you can follow it almost as a chronological steps, what is called progress. And what this progress has done is it has now created a situation where many African Americans, unlike I was able to do, me and my brothers and sisters, our daddy kept a job for 48 years in the same coal mine. Well, many boys' fathers didn't do that. A lot of the guys I grew up with, man, they went to Chicago and they ended up in the projects, you see, and their families broke up,
Right.
and they ended up in jails and in prisons and on drugs. Why? Because families got destroyed in the course of the migration.
Right.
The same way they were destroyed in the course of the migration that brought them across the ocean.
Right. Well, no, I mean, you're making great connections, and I really hope the audience takes notes, and because this could actually not just by the way information, this can help with their dissertation, their thesis. So we're about to wrap up, and I'm going to have to get you back on this show again, not just to celebrate you as the African American Folklorist of the Month, but just to put context, because you've made so many connections that people are wondering about. But I want to ask you about, lastly, the idea that, for me, W.E.B. Du Bois, who's a sociologist and was in Harvard at the inception of the American Folklore Society, and I always preface that because of the three white men who created this organization in that area around that time. However, W.E.B. Du Bois, to me, would be one of the first, outside of Charlotte Fortin Gremke, to employ what we call ethnographic and folkloristic methodology.
Mm-hmm.
So the last question is the academic question. So you, as a sociologist and a cultural historian, I see you in that same vein of utilizing these methodologies. Is there a difference? What is a folklorist to you? And is there a difference between sociology and folklore in the Black space or just space?
I thank you for the reference to W.E.B. Du Bois. Somewhere over here in my study, I have the collected works of W.E.B. Du Bois. It's 15 volumes. Ooh. Now imagine, if you look behind me, is some of my books from wall to wall. And there are a few things on this wall back here that are copies of articles I have written. And I have some of the most sophisticated equipment to write and store as anybody might have. And every time I walk in my study here and I look at the collected works of W.E.B. Du Bois, I just marvel at how did that man write all of that stuff when they didn't have Hewlett-Packard computers, when they did not have access to information as readily as me and you have. I mean, for example, I've kiddingly, though not totally in humor, I've told students over the years, if when I was in school and I would have to go into a library and use something called the Dewey Decimal System, well, see, they don't have to have that anymore. My grandchildren can pick up a device that looks like this. and it has more storage capacity than the Library of Congress. That cell phone right there.
Right.
So I've told kids, as recently a couple weeks ago, I spoke. I have a good friend that invited me to come to Yale not long ago in New Haven, and they have everything there. And I said, you know, some kids, if they had all these tools, can you imagine how much stuff W.E.B. Du Bois would have done? Because he did his with a legal pad and a typewriter.
Right.
Now, to get specifically into your question about folklore and sociology, let me mention very quickly that everybody ought to take note of something that happened last week in the state of Florida. The Florida State Department of Education, by decree last week, said in the state of Florida, sociology will no longer be taught as a general studies requirement. You cannot teach sociology anymore in the state of Florida because we consider sociology nothing but woke ideology. So,
no.
So as you know, when you're in the average liberal arts college, or even if you're at Caltech, or if you're at MIT, if you're pursuing any degree, they always say you have to have 9 hours of social science, political science, anthropology, sociology, history, geography, you know, what they call the soft sciences. Okay. And so imagine in 2 years in the state of Florida, you can get a degree from Central Florida University, from even Florida A&M will not be allowed to teach sociology 101 anymore. That speaks a lot. Of course, last week in the state of Ohio, they cut out 95 majors, 95 degrees from Central State, Ohio State, Ohio University, Kent State, just name every state college in Ohio. They sliced them in half. And virtually everywhere where there was a course in African American studies, the first course they cut. African American studies. Music. They are cutting music. In my own home state last week, you may have saw where the state legislature there said, either we're going to shut down Kentucky State entirely, or it must opt to be a polytechnical institution.
Right.
And what does that mean for music? What does that mean for music majors, music education majors? They don't want that anymore. So you know what's going to happen to anybody at Western Kentucky University that had one of the best folklore programs in this country. Bloomington, they better watch it there in Indiana, because the same supermajority Republican legislatures are everywhere, and they're cutting back anything that reminds them vaguely of what they call DEI. DEI is DEAD. And so all of that in the next generation of my grandchildren, they will have to be taught at home because the little they've been teaching in the course of my adult life is now being pushed out of the academies. And of course, one of the reasons sociology finds itself where it is right now in many states is that we've never really been considered a science. Because, you know, in geometry and in calculus and in physics and in trigonometry, they have measures which everybody agrees on. You know, everybody agrees on the formula for this and the chemical composition of that. But few people can agree on what constitutes oppression, what constitutes racism. Right. How do you measure it? How can you say that this is morally right and this is morally wrong? You know, how can you say there's a dilemma between what we're saying about healthcare and who is getting healthcare? Well, when sociologists go out and study the every year, for example, you see something coming from the Urban League for the last 50 years called the State of Black America. Right. Well, how do you determine that state of Black America? Some sociologists, some demographer, some ethnographer, some Zora Neale Hurston. And when you go to do those kind of studies, you also take your own prejudices,
right,
and values and orientations with you. It determines what you study. And a lot of times people in some of the so-called sciences or the so-called hard sciences will try to convince you that their decisions are not influenced by their values. Well, if that were the case, they would never have done the syphilis studies, would they?
That is very true.
You see,
yes,
they did studies on Black women because they think Black women's bodies did not absorb the hurt the same way, so they could study them objectively. Why, my God, how can you call that objective? So what gets called objective science and social science is sometimes just a matter of one's perspective. The way people interpret history, it's a matter of perspective. And, you know, as they say, we're going to lose a lot when there's nobody in the rooms with a perspective different than the power elites whose perspectives drive academia.
Oh, right there, sir. That was, whoo. So I have to thank you. I really got to get you back on the show so we can, a forum, so we can speak deeper about a lot of these things. We appreciate your work and appreciate your time. And is there any other place that we could find you outside of your website here showing?
What'd you say?
Is there any other place we could find you and your work outside of the website here?
Yeah, my website's got my own information on it, but also too, for whatever reason, I'm honored that if you Google my name, it'll come up with a number of things. Yeah.
Very groovy. Dr.
Okay.
Turner, thank you so much. You all have heard it here. Please, and get the book. This is now on my qualification exam list. Thank you, good sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. God bless you.